Hello, this is Ed Chapman, and this is the 7th part of the videocast series on cellular respiration and fermentation. And today we're going to focus on regulation, which is absolutely critical to these processes. If respiration goes too fast, the cell runs a risk of overheating. It can get too hot. Another word for that is hyperthermia. In humans, you've probably heard of people going into a fever situation. That's when their respiration, primarily aerobic respiration, is just cranking out too much ATP and too much heat. All right, when respiration goes too fast, you can also waste energy. Energy is never easy to come by in nature. There's always a deficit of it. You always need more. So wasting it just does not make moment-to-moment sense or evolutionary sense, definitely. And finally, if respiration goes too fast, the cell might be overwhelmed by waste products, otherwise known as metabolites. Something may build up in the system that can't be cleared away fast enough, and that could cause a problem. Now, conversely, respiration can go too slow, and if the respiration pathways are not making enough ATP, then you could maybe have cells dying because they're literally starving for energy. And if enough cells die, you could have tissue dying. And if enough tissues die, you could even have organ death. For example, common example of this is what happens with a heart attack. In most heart attack situations, the muscle of the heart can't get enough oxygen because either there's a blockage or there's a problem with the circulatory system. That means that the muscles of the heart, which have to constantly move and consume ATP to move, are going to run out of ATP and stop moving. And of course, when they stop moving, circulation stops and the whole thing just gets very bad very quickly. So that's a good example of respiration not being fast enough. And finally, respiration generates body heat. So if an organism can't do respiration fast enough, it may go hypothermic or enter a condition called hypothermia, where the body temperature just falls too low for enzymes to work properly. So what we're talking about altogether here is an old chestnut of a word from biology, homeostasis. So the goal from moment to moment of cells, tissues, and organs is to maintain respiration pathways at just the right rate, not too fast, not too slow. Don't want to waste energy, don't want to overheat, don't want to produce too many waste products, but want to get the job done. You want to stay alive. All right, the idea of supply and demand is central to the metabolic pathways that are part of respiration. A cell is going to use for energy what it has available, and there is, of course, a hierarchy for this. Cells can oxidize proteins as well as fats and carbohydrates like glucose, and they will always use the carbohydrates and fats first if they're available. Of course, in a starvation situation where there isn't enough food available, bodies can actually start to digest the proteins that are in their muscles in order to get some energy. This diagram here is kind of breaking it down for you, showing how each of these reactants, these energy sources or foods, how they enter the whole pathway. And as you can see, here's the standard one that we talked about. Sugars, which are carbohydrates, go through glycolysis, and the glucose gets broken down into pyruvate. The pyruvate teams up with acetyl-CoA and goes into the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle, of course, cranks out NADH, which then feeds into the electron transport chain where you get most of your ATP being produced. All right. But look what happens with proteins. Proteins are hydrolyzed into amino acids, and they enter the pathway all the way down here after most of glycolysis is over with, or they can enter at this point, or they can feed directly into the Krebs cycle. There are other subsidiary or additional metabolic pathways that can handle protein molecules and get energy out of them. Notice, though, when you metabolize proteins, you produce a waste product, ammonia, which is going to become urea, which has to be got rid of. That's one of those metabolites we talked about that can build up. So there is a big price to pay for metabolizing proteins. All right, fats are also oxidized very similarly to carbohydrates. They're very similar. Fats enter at the this sort of in the middle of glycolysis, represented by this green box. Fatty acids feed in a little farther down, right before the Krebs cycle. So I'm hoping you can see the point of this diagram, which is to show you that your cells, or animal cells and plant cells, can metabolize carbohydrates, which is the first choice, and then fats, and finally proteins if they have to. Okay, now we've already talked about negative feedback loops. Earlier, a negative feedback loop is when the product of a metabolic pathway acts as an inhibitor for a step earlier in the pathway. And the most important one to know is ATP. ATP can actually function as a negative feedback loop inhibitor. And let me show you how. So we've already talked about how glucose can go through glycolysis and produce some ATPs. All right, so glucose gets broken down into pyruvate through a whole bunch of steps, and we get some ATP produced. If there's enough ATP in play already made, ATP can feed back and shut down a critical enzyme in glycolysis called phosphofructokinase. All right, so too much ATP and this gets shut down. Sorry about that. All right, now ATP is also produced from the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. But all these also produce ATP. So the point is, if there's enough ATP being made, okay, it's going to act as an inhibitor and stop the whole process that's feeding into all these down here. All right. Now, another chemical called citrate can shut down up here, and something called AMP, which is ATP minus 2-phosphate groups. These can also act as a stimulator to speed things up. But if you know that ATP can inhibit glycolysis at this stage right here and reduce the production of ATP because there's enough of it, that's the main idea. All right. Okay, cellular respiration is controlled by a negative. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, we're done. Thanks for listening, and we are now finished with respiration.